You know, I'll give you an instance, an idea. A girl from Lewiston, she was from Lewiston, she's not now. Can't think of her name for a second. She was one of my students at one time. She stayed with my sister in Sydney for 3 weeks. And she was in a place which had a bar and a restaurant, which is not very common in Australia to see the two together, except in some downtown places. But 3 men were having a discussion. And they were talking about it, and she just happened to overhear part of it. They were talking loudly, and she laughed, and they said, "What do you think, miss? What's your opinion of that?" She gave her opinion and said, "Hello, what have we got here? A bloody Yank." Next thing, they're inviting her to have drinks, to have lunch with them. And that is how people regard the United States. We are one of the best allies the United States has. And even though we've got probably one of the worst prime ministers in Australia you could have now. The other man, I've heard him criticised before that, but he was criticised more for his accent than anything. A professor of languages.
Are we learning from them or they learn from us?
I don't know, I think you better not learn from them. But the point was, he's a much safer man for the country than the present Prime Minister. See, in Australia, the Liberal Party is equivalent to the Republican Party here. The Labor Party is equivalent to the Democratic Party here. That's strange though it may seem. And he was a Labor man, but he was a good man for the country. But you've got to be careful when you're evaluating these people. Look at their background and see what they're doing, and listen to the illogical treatment on the press, the media.
It's crazy.
Absolutely, I've never heard anything so unjust as what I've heard on the media here, the way they're doing it. I mean, there's only one party to vote for, according to them. Well, I'm not going to say what I would vote for, but you've got to be careful when you're thinking about how valuable a country is. Who can manage the common good? That's the point. And we study that, and I've been teaching that for more years than I can tell you. The nature of the common good, political authority, how far does it go? What is the exact political authority? And what I'm hearing almost daily is socialistic. And in our teaching on this, going right back to the days of Socrates, and that's 26 centuries or 25 centuries ago. You've got to be very careful. And the state, all this talk about healthcare, that's not the function of the state. They are private goods. In an emergency, that's a different matter. But private goods are not the function of government. It's the common good. That's the measure of the function of government. And there are major proofs of that. Principle of subsidiarity, for instance. What can be done by the lower should not be done by the higher. In other words, if you can administer health to yourself or to others, you should do it, not the government. The government should see, though, and it's not doing this, and I'm going to deal with that a little bit tonight in the second hour. The government should see that you are able to remove the impediments, the hindrances, so that you can look after your health. And you and I, let's suppose I'm your doctor and you're the patient. Well, you and I should do that between us, not between you and me and the government. My good friend, a physician in Australia, he was head of the big St. Vincent's Hospital there, and Dr. Henry Pearce and I taught philosophy. He was a wonderful physician, marvellous diagnostician, could sniff the atmosphere in a room and tell you what the patient had. He was a marvellous philosopher and a world-class economist. So he says this: once the patient had to support a physician and the pharmacist. Now they have to support the physician, the pharmacist, and the government. And everything's become dearer. I was a pharmacist, remember. I was right in on the ground floor of all this. Anyway, and incidentally, why a lot of the people are not coming to classes, I do know why, because they have contacted me. One person who has not been here since this course started deeply regrets it and contacted me yesterday, as a matter of fact. That's just one of a number. Anyway, that's all beside the point. So if anybody wants to make a comment, feel free to do it. But as far as I'm concerned, truth is the only thing that matters to me. And if somebody's bad for the country, I'd be very wary. And a lot of the things, listening to the logic all the time is absolutely shocking, what I'm hearing on radio and television. Well, enough said of that. Now we have dealt with this. What is characteristic of living things is immanent activity, namely the agent. In other words, when I use the word agent, I mean the one acting. That's the proper meaning of the word, ago in Latin, the one acting. That's an idea. Just to show you how this goes. This is the Latin word, ago. Agere. I've forgotten the imperfect, actum, or actus. I act, or I have acted. So you see, action, the one that's the agent, we get the word agent from that. Excuse me. We get the word acting, or act, to act, through that. Now, the agent does the act, and the agent benefits from the act. Don't forget that all the way through the living. We're dealing with the living things. The agent does the act, and the agent benefits from the act. Now, so we saw that's what's characteristic of living things. And we saw the, where we are. We're using logic to discover all of this. So man is an operational whole organism, and consequently it's all immanent action all the way through with him. So we saw that there are three signs in living things which show this immanent action. The reactions of irritability, in other words, a specific response. I use the action of the mimosa, for instance, the mimosa plant. But look at all the other things. Take plants, because they're the simplest thing to deal with. You find certain plants must have shade. Other plants must have sunlight. Aristotle observed that when Alexander the Great sent to him plants from his various conquests, lands of conquest. So that irritability is the first sign. In other words, a reaction. Look at the way the eye reacts to light, etc. I can remember my chairman at Niagara University, one of the chairmen that we had while I was there. He was shocked one day to see me with my hands on the face of a blonde. What I was doing, she said she had concussion. She had concussion. And I did a test on her by watching the reaction of the pupil, and he thought I was holding a face in my hand. He said, "What the hell are you up to?" He said. All I was doing was testing the pupil reaction. Then there's internal finality. That the agent, the thing operating, operates for its own self. In other words, all the parts operating for the good of the whole organism. Then there's nutrition, where we turn another substance into our substance. Another sign of immanent action. Then we saw, try and see the whole picture, my friends. The principle of vital operation. There are different teachings, and only one is in accord with reality. And that is the animism. Now we have to be careful of that doctrine, that word, because it unfortunately is used by anthropologists in a different way. Animism, for some people, means the soul goes out wandering at night, amongst American Indians, for instance. Other ones say that everything exists with a soul. That's not what we mean. Living things have a special form. Form is what makes a thing be what it is. If it does be a dog, it has one form. If it does be a kangaroo, it has another form. If the dog is black, it's got another form added to it, and what we call an accidental form. If the dog is, say, got red hair, well, it's another form, accidental form. If the dog's tall, that's another form. There are 10 possible forms altogether. Now, this is called the doctrine of hylomorphism. Hylomorphism comes from two words. I don't remember whether I gave you that before. It comes from morphe in Greek means shape. Hule, as it really, we write it hyle in English, but hule in Greek means shape. I'm sorry, what am I saying? Shape, matter, shape. Matter and form, that's what it really means. Matter and form. That's the real meaning of it. And it means this, that everything is made up of two principles. One which makes it be what it is, and the other one which divides it into individuals. That's the meaning of it. That's what hylomorphism is. The same cannot be the reason of opposites, and one and many are opposites. So there's a principle which makes things be one, and a principle which makes things be many. That's a very simple application. In other words, supposing this gentleman's name is Bob, and he's Bob, there's one reason why he's a human person, and another reason why he's Bob. There's a reason why this lady is a human person, but there's another reason why she's Suzanne. So we're divided off into other things. Remember, I tore the sheet of paper in halves. There's one reason. Whiteness is a reason of oneness between them. But when I divide the matter, I divide the form, the whiteness. So there are two principles in every bodily thing. One which makes it be what it is, and one which makes it be the individual that it is. That's called hylomorphism. And that goes right back to the days of Socrates and Plato. But it took Aristotle to correct him. Plato understood form beautifully and gave it a complex explanation. We'll deal with that later. But he didn't understand matter, as Aristotle pointed out. He didn't quite understand the place that matter occupies in reality. So, in living things, we call the form the substantial form, not the accidental forms like shape, colour, etc., but the substantial form that makes it be a substance. We call that, in living things, we call it soul. Call it what you like one biologist, professor, calls it a biogenic principle. I don't like that word soul, it's a religious word. It's not a religious word, it goes back thousands of years. In the old Anglo-Saxon languages, soul, S-A-W-O-L, soul, long before the Christian era. Too many people, like that young woman in Ottawa said to me, qu'est-ce que vous faites encore? What do you do again? She said she was from Haiti. I don't know how to say it in English. Haiti, is it? I hate it too. But it's Haiti in French, you don't pronounce the H. Anyway, I said, I'm a professor of philosophy. Ah, la philosophie, c'est la même chose que la religion, n'est-ce pas? Philosophy is the same thing as religion. Good God, my friends, put theology, which is what she should have said. Religion is a relationship with God, that's a practice. But theology is the science. On that wall, and philosophy on that wall, all other knowledges lie between. Don't confuse them. One's based upon its principles of faith, one's principles of reason, which the human intellect can grasp from reality itself. We'll have more to say about that. So obviously, animism, the way the philosopher uses it, means that body and soul form one substance. Body and soul form one substance. In other words, the matter and the form one substance. So it's also known as the theory of hylomorphism. So there's a proof there on whatever page it is, 12. And I've got another page which I didn't give you. It wasn't on the computer, and I don't know why. But it's just the same sort of thing, set up in a different way. I'll send it through to you sometime. Then we saw, are there degrees of life? Yes, we showed the degrees of life. So there are degrees of the principle of life. In other words, degrees of soul. There's the soul of a plant, the soul of an animal, and the soul of man. There are 3 degrees of bodily life. And just to revamp that again, plants can do the act. They actually do the act, give themselves the act, is a better way of putting it. But the form of the act is fixed by nature. And the purpose of the act is fixed by nature. Brutes can give themselves the action, the very action, but also the form of the action. The dog sees the car and chases it, or it sees a hare and chases it, or picks out a comb and puts it back in its place. Sorry about that, but evidently it went right over your heads. Hare with a comb. So, sorry about that, that's my weak humour. But the brute can give itself the actual action, it does the action. Now, an instrument doesn't. This doesn't give itself the action. Non-living things don't give themselves the action. It does the act because it receives it from me. I'm doing the act, only using that. So an instrument is a different thing, you see. Non-living things can only affect other things. Acid can only corrode other things. It doesn't corrode itself. So brutes give themselves the action and give themselves the form of the action. Think of the dog. Or the bird. The bird aims for this tree. It's fluttering for this tree or that tree. Gives itself the form of the action. But man can give himself the action, the form, and why he's doing the action, the purpose. Example I could use, as I did before, eating. He might be eating, the end of the action is fixed by nature, nutrition. But the purpose for which he does that is he gives it to himself. As they say in French, merci buckets. If there are 3 degrees of life, there must be 3 degrees of principle of life. Incidentally, I understand in the presence of a German scholar here that, Joe, is it right they say you can't, do you know anything about the Dutch language? They say you cannot pun in Dutch, but even not very much in German. Would that?
I've never heard that. But.
Yeah. Well, in French you can pun all the time. You have to be careful, you know.
How about meine Deutsch ist nicht so heiß?
Nicht so heißen.
Nicht so heiß.
Warum das? Why?
Because a German will first visualize steam coming out of your...
See. Yes. Well, we won't dwell out too long on that. Now remember, these 3 degrees of life are all alike in conferring life on the thing, but they're different manners. And we call that, what do we call it? Analogical likeness. They're not univocal, they're not the same exactly. They're like, but more unlike. That's what univocity is. And Dr. Pierce used to make the joke that the students were so badly taught in the universities, they weren't taught about analogy, so they gave them the univocity medal. So this is there are 3 degrees of life, therefore there are 3 degrees of principle of life. In other words, 3 degrees of soul. Remember, univocal use of a term. Bob is an animal, a dog or a flea is an animal. They're utterly the same, in as much as they're animals. Equivocal use of a term. A dog has a tick, and my watch has a tick. Who's got my watch? So there's utterly unsame, the meaning there. Analogous. The foot of a mountain or the foot of a man. There's some likeness in meaning, but more unlikeness. In Sydney Harbour we have a rock at one inlet of the harbour, or just off the shipping lines, and they've got a big rock and surrounded by little rocks, and they call it the sow and pigs. In other words, a mother and the baby pigs. So we speak with analogy a lot in our language. I can remember my mother calling me a bookworm. Well, I didn't go like that through the books, but or somebody tearing up the road. You can imagine him tearing up the road, couldn't you? That's all analogy. In other words, it participates something of the other two terms, or the other meanings. Then we saw the operations of living organisms in general. We saw there are 5 genera, or 5 kinds. The word genera, by the way, and the word kind are the same word. In Europe, languages go like this: p, t, k, b, d, g, m, n. Whoops. Oh, forgot how to do it. This uses the lips and voice, lips, voice, and nose. Now, in Northern Europe, the tendency's there. In Southern Europe, the tendency's here. Now, kind, ny, is the same as that. In Northern, this word no. That's how it is in say, the north of Europe. In the southern Europe, it's, if you know any Italian, you know that that's the gnosco, as they say. This is the ny sound, with lips, voice, and nose. The tendency is up there. So kind is that, and as you get further down south, genus. So genus is something you understand. Species comes from another Latin word, which means the look of something. Your face or your look. That's what your species is. You know it by looking at something. Genus, you have to know it by something more intellectual, not by senses. The species is more discovered by senses, and the genus more by a rational act. Now, where was we? Yes, the genera of powers. So we saw there are 5 genera of powers. Now, or genuses as we would often say in English. Man as vegetative organism. Now when I say man as vegetative organism, all of this applies to plants, brutes and man. All got these 3 powers: nutrition, growth, generation. Remember, nutrition helps the substance. Its object is it's related to the substance. It operates making more substance, replacing substance, and all that. Growth brings the due perfection of the individual. So nutrition and growth, they aim at helping the individual person. But reproduction, that aims at helping perfecting the species. So then, male and female complementarities, especially more noticeable in the higher organisms, show that sexual activity, remember there are 2 ways plants can reproduce. The higher ones don't produce that way. Reproduce by, what's it called again? There's sexual reproduction and there's, can't think of the name, vegetative reproduction, where you take a part of a plant and just put it in and it sprouts its own roots, etc. That's for lower things. So, but approximately, it's for the good of the parents, but ultimately for the good of the species. And we saw, I think, did we see the 3 activities, 3 doctrines about pleasure?
Yes.
Yes. Hedonism, all pleasure is good. Pleasure is automatically good. Puritanism, all pleasure is automatically bad, according to the Puritanists. But an honest doctrine, or a natural law doctrine, we call it eudaimonistic honestism, the natural law doctrine, pleasure is a sign of the goodness of an act in the right circumstances. Now, we went on to nutrition. We saw there some of the stuff we ended up saying, which somebody sent me on the computer, didn't you, sister? I won't tell you who it is. A bird can eat all the worms he wants, but he'll never become a worm. A canary can eat all the canaries. A cat can eat all the canaries in the world, but he'll never become a canary, etc. Then we went to growth. Now, growth is a very interesting thing. It has its object as the due perfection of the individual, that is, the quantity and shape. A small tree is no less a tree than a big, tall tree. In other words, the great trees like out in California, I remember going through the Muir Woods forest and seeing the great, what are they call again, the redwoods. Redwoods. Magnificent. From a tiny little seed. But that tiny little seed is as much a tree as that 150, 200 foot tree that I saw. It's just as much a tree. Likewise, that little kangaroo, when they're first born, they're only about an inch long, and they crawl from into the pouch where it fixes its mouth on the bulbous nipple and stays there. So the early Australians or Englishmen exploring Australia, when they found a kangaroo, they pulled the thing off and they thought, oh, that's where young kangaroos grow, on the mother's nipple. Because mouth split and blood was there. So they thought they'd torn it off there. Now there are films showing how the mother licks the fur and the little worm-like thing just goes up through this sticky fur and gets into the pouch and then stays there for some weeks, fixed to the nipple. Anyway, growth. Now, this is a question now of a special teaching. The natural minimum and the natural maximum. How small can a living thing be? How small can, say, a molecule be? How small can a tree be? How small can a child be? The fertilized ovum is the smallest that a living thing can be. Anything smaller than that, it's not. It's a different species of thing. It has vegetative life. So, for instance, when they carry sperm from the United States, say, to Canada, from a bull to artificially inseminate a cow, that's really a vegetative life. It's not animal life. But when it unites with the ovum of the cow, then it becomes animal life. It becomes a new being, a new member of that species. So that's what the smallest a tree can be, the seed. What about the zygote? Is it different from the great tennis player, Yvonne Goolagong? Is the tree a different species of thing? Or yes, it's a different species, but is it any less living? The thing in the woman's womb, for instance, or in the kangaroo's womb, or in the tree, the seed. Is it any less than the fully grown one of its species? None whatsoever. It's quantity that's added, not substance. There's no substantial difference. There is a quantitative difference. So a big tree is the same in size, or the same in species rather, as the little seed. Somewhere I think in the Bible there's mention about the mustard seed. Remember that? Well, I don't know, I thought mustard plants were just small plants, but it talks about the mustard tree. So, how does this question apply to the embryo? Quite obvious, what we just said. To the family. What's the smallest a family can be? Well, you call it a couple, married couple, but when a child comes along, then it becomes a family. What about a civil society, such as the United States? The opinion was expressed in the Middle Ages that the minimum, or the maximum, I'm sorry, I've switched to the maximum now, the maximum that a society can be is about 1 million people. They thought, oh, after that, it's uncontrollable. Whether that's true today or not, it's anybody's guess, I suppose. Anyway, the doctrine of the natural maximum now. What is the biggest that a tree can be? Well, it depends on the species. If I said to you there's a rose bush in the garden here and it was 30 feet high, you'd say, what? But it can range over a certain range, as it were. It can go over a certain range. But you expect a certain maximum for a plant. What is the biggest that a man can be? I was in California, I think it was, waiting here, San Francisco, waiting at an airport. I was chatting to 3 GIs, by the way, very friendly lads. This is years ago. And in came a young black gentleman with the most splendid athletic body. And he walked in and he's ordering something, he's waiting there. Then in came a man about this high. And he went to talk to the other man and he spoke to him and he suddenly realised he's talking to his belly button. the man was about 7 feet tall. And a lot of people observed that. There was a bit of a giggle went round the place. But how is that the tallest that a man can be? People have been 7 foot something, haven't they? And all sorts of sizes. So what's the biggest that a human person can be? That's very hard to say. They even name some species. A paddymmelon in Australia, a plump little kangaroo. Then there's a quokka, bit big. And then there's the, what do you call it? I can't think of the terms tonight. Not a kangaroo, what's the other one, the smaller one? Wallaby, thank you. Yes, that's the one that I always say, that what do you get when you cross a kangaroo with a bottle of whiskey? You get a wobbly wallaby. So, but the different ones, they name them according to their size. Then they name, say, the black-faced wallaby as distinct from the red wallaby or something like that, or a brown wallaby. And name them from accidentals always. But size comes into it usually first. If you saw something like, a rabbit about 4 feet tall, you'd be so scared you wouldn't go to sleep, I think, for about 6 weeks. Now, what is the biggest that water can be? We know the smallest that matter can be is the molecule, which, by the way, means a little heap. That's really what the Latin terms mean. And a little heap of something like that. Like H2O, we often signify it that way, of water, for instance. But what's the biggest that things like the ocean can be? Some physicists claim that the Pacific Ocean is one molecule, one enormous molecule. Science fiction's movies stir our imagination by showing us on TV bushes and animals which are much bigger than we are accustomed to see. Is it necessary for a mouse to be small, or a rose bush to be a certain height, or a man to be a certain height? Note, the substantial form acting through its power of growth drives the living thing towards perfection within its species, gives it a tremendous urge. Little children say, "Look, Grandma, I'm this tall now." Non-living things apparently have the same size, whether the minimum or the maximum. What happens if some living thing falls short of its maximum size and shape? It is because the matter causes that. The form would make every apple tree perfect, but for the impediment of the matter. Every form aims at perfection in the species, but inherited matter causes it to have deformities, etc. It's the matter that always deforms the tree. Otherwise, every apple tree would be perfect. So, why are there many apple trees? Why isn't there just one? Why are there more dogs? Why are there so many dogs? Why isn't there just one? Why isn't there one human being? Because no bodily thing can manifest all that's needed to perfect the species. That's why. And many is necessary, because a few will not suffice. That's why there are many dogs, many apple trees. A man will walk through his orchard and say, "This apple tree is doing well, this one's not doing so well." Something inherited in it. Or maybe there might be something accidental in it, might be lacking in water or something. But a many is necessary because a few will not suffice.
Suffice for what?
To manifest all that man can be. You see? To perfect the species, you've got to have a many. Because this one does this. When I was born, Dr. Northcott, funny, I was thinking of him today. I didn't intend mentioning him. He pulled me up in the air and said, "We've got an athlete here." Because of the shape of my hips, he knew that straight away. And he was right. But this, we can sort of, you'll find somebody with a splendid physique, and he turns out to be a good singer. Somebody else with another physique, he'll turn out to be a good runner. Another person will turn out to be a good biologist, etc. So a many is necessary because a few will not suffice to manifest all that species can be. Look at the numbers of species of apples. I forget now how many. Are there 200, 300, 400 species?
There were 400 20 years ago.
Yeah. Did I say apples?
Yes.
I meant to say tomatoes, but apples is right. Yes, apples too. All the different species of apples, all the different species of tomatoes. Then there are all the individuals within the species. And you know, you go into a family, and Dr. Bonnet sends his apologies, by the way, he cannot come. He has 7 children, but they're as alike as chalk and cheese, all different ones. I think any parent, and it's not a parent that I was a parent, but I had to say that one night at a meeting somewhere. Is it not apparent that I'm not a parent? My only son died. Is it not apparent that I'm not a parent? Anyway, parents notice their children, all different. And people don't know what a woman's husband is like till they meet him. I mean, men of such great variety. They're not all bad. And sorry about that. Or as somebody said, you've heard the story, haven't you, about if a tree falls in a forest and there's no one there to listen to it, does it make a sound? We examine that in epistemology, by the way. Well, there's another story told about that. If a tree falls in a forest, and the... Pardon?
If a man says something. If a man says something
No.
with no woman to hear him,
Oh,
is he still wrong?
Is he still wrong? Yeah. Thank you. That's not the way I heard it, but that's better. Is he still wrong? I remember when I first came across that one.
If a man
Mrs.
falls-
Hayward.
If a man falls in the forest, would a feminist care?
Can I call for volunteers to escort her to a car afterwards? So, I think we've said enough about the maximum, but look at it this way. The whole of reality is teeming out there with species yet to be discovered. I was talking to a botanist in the Muagamara Aboriginal word, of course, a sanctuary in Australia on one occasion. He said, there's so many plants out there that we don't know about. We haven't got enough men or women to help discover the plants and name them. There are species of insects being discovered practically every day. All of this is to manifest the excellence of the maker, the creator. Manifest the excellence. And even an artist will sometimes do a very bad work of art, such as in painting, to manifest his excellence. Aristotle said, when an artist makes something, say any creation at all, any kind of artifact, when he does it, makes it a bad one deliberately, that's far superior to a poor artist who makes a bad one and can't help it. Far superior. Now we come to something which is, but remember, the world is teeming with species. Absolutely teeming. A couple of years ago, there's a report came from Australia that they're way down in the bowels of the earth and they've found some kind of organism that's living down there amongst minerals and things like that. It's extraordinary what exists out there. Remember every grain of sand on a beach. And what about 90 Mile Beach in Australia? All this golden sand for 90 miles. Every one of those grains of sand is known to the author. We'll prove that later. So we come now to C, vital generation. I like this one. And we'll put some of it on the board, as much as we need on the board. We're going to compare vital generation. We compare it with non-vital generation. So we'll take something like water, and it takes hydrogen and oxygen to make water. Believe me, we waters know. Then little Joey, it takes Bob and Betty to make little Joey. So we're going to compare those two now. I used to say Bill and Betty as Dr. Woodbury used to, but I made a couple of slips and I'll never do it again. I always say Bob and Betty, and I'm not going to tell you what the slip was. I know it was enough to cause some medical students to nearly fall over the floor laughing at my very red face. And I did say when Betty makes love to Belly instead of saying when Billy makes love to Betty. So there are differences. Now, one of them, this one is transitive action. It operates on nothing. This one, imminent action. This produces something new. This produces the same species. So the species is imminent. Now notice, first the generants are of different species here. So we'll just put the word species.
Central Service, please call 2077
Species.
Central Service.
These two are same species. This is all in your notes, of course. Same species. Now there, 3, the generated diverse species. Generated same species. In other words, little Joey's the same species as Betty and Bob. 4, there's destruction of the generants. In other words, it's no longer hydrogen and oxygen. Now, of course, there are always students who say, but water's H2O, they still exist. That is only a schematic, a mathematical schematization of water. Water is another substance. We can't say what it is in itself, really, so we use the generants to write it. It's a mathematical schematization of water. It's a different substance. So the hydrogen and the oxygen no longer exist. No destruction. There's no destruction of the generants. Bob and Betty don't cease to exist. Thirdly, there's entropic action, a fifth of so to say. There's entropy. Entropy. Here, there's ectropy. In other words, they come down to neutral, as it were. Here they still remain what they are in species. They still remain separate individual persons in that species. Here it comes down to 0, or equilibrium. This doesn't come down to equilibrium. It produces a new living individual. So there's a great difference between vital generation and, in other words, physical generation, non-vital generation. We could say this, by the way, just as an aside, it could appear elsewhere. And I was delighted, years after I'd learned this, to discover it written beautifully in Aristotle. The man was amazing. The stuff that he observed, his observations powers were extraordinary, both in botanical and zoological specimens. As I mentioned before, Alexander the Great, when he was conquering various places in Greece, etc., and north of Greece, he sent specimens back to Alexander the Great. Aristotle, rather. Yes, thank you. Note that all animal quarrels and other passion states are about eaties and sexies, things to be eaten and sexual matters. The same can be said about some men. One of my students called out, "Oh, it just sounds like my boyfriend." Sex is a powerful force in man. Freud saw this and St. Thomas saw this. They were aware of that. Sex educationists seem to forget this, as Frank Sheed points out. Frank Sheed says that sexual powers are a very powerful force in mankind. I was giving a lecture. I was invited to the University of Buffalo one day to give a lecture, and I had on sex education. And I had these people sitting in front of me there, and one very attractive young woman said, "I don't think teaching about sex in schools is any different from teaching arithmetic." We had been talking about how this subject could go on and on and on, and we could be there all night and till 3 o'clock in the morning. So I said to her, "Would you like to sit till 3 o'clock in the morning in my car or your car? Or would you rather talk about sex, or would you rather talk about something else?" "No, thank you," she said. The class laughed because they knew she'd put a foot in it. It is different. Oh, I said, "I'm sorry, talk about arithmetic." So there's a big difference between talking about arithmetic and talking about sex. In any case, she made the point. She said to me, "Oh, you've made your point." They were all teachers that I was talking to at the time. "We have strong urges for basic requirements to eat and to reproduce. This is necessary for the purpose of conserving ourselves as individuals and as members of the species." That's clear enough. So, remember that reproduction has been observed by the ancient Greeks in this manner. Good is diffusive of itself. Good, it's a principle of very fundamental principle. Good is diffusive of itself. I've seen when teaching at various universities, young people come in, I can see girls sometimes saying, look what he gave me last night, showing her wedding or her engagement ring off. And I found myself, I won a lottery one day, $10,000 at St. Joseph's Church, and something like $50 a ticket, and I won the 10,000. I found myself saying, "I just won 10,000. Did you know that?" Good is diffusive of itself. You want to shout it to the rooftops if you win something like that. So, we each love our being by a natural love that we want to conserve it in being and want to make imitations of our being. So, Bob and Betty want to make little Joeys. An individual of a species, for instance the group called man, ought to be concerned about the development of the species. This does not permit so-called eugenics, many means of which are immoral and do not work anyway. That's what's so strange about eugenics. It doesn't work. I remember the story told about a physician he was an embryologist, I think, in a university, and he asked the crowd about certain situation, how they would react to it. He said, for instance, I heard of a man and woman who had 4 children. Those 4 children had congenital syphilis, in other words, inherited from the parents. One was deaf, one was dumb. I think 3 or maybe all have had rickets, lack of vitamin D, etc., etc., etc. And now she's pregnant again. What would you recommend? He said to the audience. You know this one, Joe, don't you? Don't you? What would you recommend? And all abort. They all recommended abortion. Congratulations, ladies and gentlemen. You've just killed one of the greatest geniuses the world has ever known, Ludwig van Beethoven.
Wow.
There was silence in the auditorium after that. As one good geneticist said, you can never predict what the offspring are going to be. You cannot predict. If you study Mendel's experiments and his laws, etc., you've got to work hard to breed what you want. You've got to work hard. But eugenics, by the way, comes from the word EU. In other words, genus, that's the Greek spelling of it. Genus, a good genus, a good species, a good kind of offspring. That's what that means. So it doesn't work. You still don't know how it's going to turn out. One psychiatrist, famous psychiatrist whose name I cannot remember now, it's years since I've mentioned it, but he said in Boston that, I have these works at home, he said that you can never predict the mentality of an offspring. You don't know what geniuses you might have killed if you do try to practice eugenics. Therefore, suicide, abortion, murder, euthanasia, and every procedure affecting man is the concern of the whole race. As St. Thomas says, to kill oneself, for instance, is to rob the human race of one of its members. That's one of 3 arguments used about suicide. We've got no right to suicide. We're robbing the human race. We're acting contrary to human nature, human natural inclination, etc. We'll come to more of that later. So each plant and brute animal exists for the good of the species. Each helps perfect the species. It takes many to manifest all that a plant can be, same with brutes. Man alone exists for his own good and the good of the species. Man alone. Why? Because he's a person. Dog is not a person. I've heard that young women particularly have claimed in writings, they're people too. A person is a rational supposit. Dogs are not persons. That's what a person is, a rational, individual, acting being. Rational, individual, acting being. So we'll prove that later that they are not persons. You remember this, my friends. Each person is worth more than the whole universe of plants, brutes, and all the stars in the sky. One person is greater than all those things. So when God said to man, go forth and multiply, there's an obligation on the human race, not the individual, but the human race. An individual may be exempted from that for some reason, special reason. You heard what happened? God made man special, looked at him and said, whoops, then he made woman. I'll collect the fee as you go out of the door. Or as one person put it, he made man and he looked at him and said, surely to goodness I can do better than that. And he made woman. Well, my mother used to say, woman came after man and she's been after him ever since. So remember, each organ in those things has its proper use, as the old pagan Aristotle taught. And the reproductive organs are for that, the sake of that. But this is ethics we're talking now. We're not talking philosophy of human nature. But let me say this. It is never lawful to act for pleasure alone. We can intend pleasure, but to reject the purpose of the pleasure, the end for which the pleasure exists, no. We cannot do that. All it means is that the end ought not be directly excluded. It does not mean producing babies is the only reason for sex. I did not say that. I'm saying the ultimate reason is for reproduction. It is not lawful to reject a greater good for a lesser, the end for the means. In other words, if you're eating food and you go, as the Romans did with the vomitorium, tickle the back of the throat or drink ipecacuanha wine and vomit up, that's contrary to human nature. You're rejecting the greater good for the lesser. And the human nature, adequately understood, is the measure of how we ought to act. It's not lawful to reject the end for the means. It is not lawful to reject the end for pleasure. It is not lawful to act for pleasure alone. In other words, the pleasure should be open to the end for which it exists. Note that sex has two functions, unitive and reproductive. There used to be a method. We used to, I might go just for a second or two over time because we can finish with this section then. This is how we used to put it. The domestic society consists of two levels. First, there was the conjugal society. And that's Bob and Betty. And they act for mutual love, mutual aid, and a natural remedy for concupiscence. In other words, sexual desire. Pardon my writing, it's so bad. And then the conjugal society existed for the family society. So it is a preparation for that. When Bob and Betty get together, get married, mutual love, mutual aid. And by heaven, you know as well as I do, two people together, working together, can accomplish a lot more than each of those two persons alone. Mutual aid and a natural remedy for concupiscence or sexual desire. The family society, its end is new, live man. Or new live human, member of the human race, if you like. So, little Joey. And this is a suitable atmosphere for that. Notwithstanding all the wrong stuff that's being put around. I published a paper on that if anybody's interested. So that's how we used to put it. And people used to say, oh, you're demoting this. You're reducing the conjugal society to a second grade. In other words, marriage is second grade. Family is the only real existing society, they say. But the way I put it now is Bob and Betty, then they form the conjugal society, then they form the familial society. This is conjugal society is on the way to that. What if they don't have children? Well, that's accidental. That's nature's problem. Nature's caused that. What I'm talking about, they can't have children, for instance, if one or the other is sterile. And that is a perfectly okay marriage, as we show in ethics. But if one or the other sterilizes themselves, or have themselves sterilized, that's a different matter, of course. That's deliberately rejecting the end. We could carry this on, put new, live man. It overcomes a lot of the objections. So, my friends, this is the unitive function here, conjugal society, and this is the reproductive function. And that's how the physicians like to put it. When I've attended medical conferences, that's how it always comes up. The unitive and reproductive. Well, it looks like we come to the end of that section. The next section we start on will be knowledge. And we'll see why it's the next section. We'll see that presently. What I propose to do now after this is to mention something about the natural law with respect to the body economic, which is so much in the news. And I sent out a paper, which, by the way, was the wrong paper. But that doesn't matter. Something strange. I've had this happen a couple of times on my computer. It's given one title, and then it gives you a different paper. I've looked at it backwards and forwards and said, what the heck is going on? I don't know. How that happens, I don't know. In any case, I sent out what should have been the two faces of capitalism, but it doesn't matter. Mr. Venari made a nice comment about that paper. He thought that was a good one. Yes, it is a good paper. It's not been published yet, but the two faces of capitalism has been published. And that's why it was ruined so